Hi, Jamie. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Hi.
Hi, sorry about the delay. We had some technical issues. Can you go ahead and test your microphone real quick?
Sure. How do you want me to just talk right now to test it, or should I hit the little buttons that they
That
have?
yeah, that's perfect what you're doing right there. We can hear you in the room.
Great.
Um, and then did you want to just share your screen to do your presentation?
That would be perfect.
Okay. Yeah, if you want to share your screen.
We're ready to get started.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, I'll do that. Oh, it does say the host disabled is on, so you just need to make me a co-host or a co-host.
Yeah, give me 1 second.
No problem.
Yeah, if you could really quick. It's been a while since I've done this. All right, Jamie, we've got you on, we got your presentation up here, and I think you are good to go. I think you're muted there, Jamie.
Okay, there we go. So I don't think you can see my notes. Should be good. So I'll go ahead and get started. And I wanted to also let folks know that, well, firstly, I'm Jamie Gatewood, and I'm the Education and Outreach Manager at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. And I have the pleasure of covering the Southern Oregon region of the state. And so that's from, Coos, Curry County, all the way over to Lake County. And then another one of our staff, Glenda Moyer, starts covering the entire eastern part of the state there. But we do have staff that covers every region of the state. We're really excited about that, to have people on the ground, in 5 different regions, working together to cover the whole state. And also, I will have a moment at the end of the presentation if folks have questions. I'll do my best to answer those. And then also, my colleague is in the room live, Sam Goldberg, and Sam can also help to answer questions too. So just to let you know, there'll be opportunity for that. So a little bit about us. The Fair Housing Council of Oregon celebrated 30 years of operation in November 2020. So we've been doing this work for a long time, and we promote housing justice, equity, and inclusion. We do offer services for folks who are experiencing discrimination in housing. Also, if there are housing providers who have questions, or anyone who touches the housing market really can call us and get in touch to ask questions. And if somebody is experiencing discrimination in housing, we offer advocacy services that can look different just depending on the situation, but they'll ask some questions and then maybe be able to advocate directly for someone, explain, to the person who wasn't upholding fair housing laws, what those laws are. And about 70% of the time that can resolve the issue. But also, if the person prefers, we can assist them in filing a claim with the Department of Housing and Urban Development or the Bureau of Labor and Industry. We try to make those services really accessible. So we don't ask questions about income. They're offered regardless of immigration status. We don't charge money for those services. And we use the language bank so that we can communicate with anyone who's calling and assist them. So that's just a little bit about our services as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we do as an organization as the presentation moves forward. So let's see what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go over some fair housing basics, just a little bit of the definitions, who's covered under these laws and where the laws are applied. And we'll go over a brief history of discriminatory zoning and land use. We'll talk about jurisdictions and affirmatively furthering fair housing, so what they're doing to push forward fair housing in their communities and some of the requirements to do that. We'll go over how the housing crisis in Oregon, the needs that we're seeing, and talk a little bit about when there's community pushback to needed housing development and how we as an organization are encouraging folks to address that pushback. And we'll talk about what cities are doing to address the housing need. And lastly, strategies to promote inclusive communities, specifically promote housing types that are needed for all of the incomes in Oregon so that everyone has housing opportunity, housing choice, and can live in communities that they choose. So again, the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, we are a statewide civil rights organization. So we're a nonprofit and we have staff that covers the entire state. We proactively promote housing justice, equity, and inclusion. And we do that through the enforcement of fair housing laws. So we provide pathways through those advocacy services I talked about at the beginning, and also through education, like what we're doing right now. And it's a really amazing part of this job. We get to provide education to folks, pretty much anyone touching the housing market. So I get to talk to people who are navigating the rental market. We get to talk with housing providers. We get to work with jurisdictions about, what they're doing around affirmatively furthering fair housing, and, many other folks like home buyers. So pretty much everybody who's involved in housing. And what are fair housing laws? They're civil rights laws that promote equal access to housing. And they make it illegal for housing providers to discriminate against certain groups. Those are protected class individuals and families, and we'll go over who they are in just a moment. And these laws also make it illegal for cities and counties and jurisdictions to limit housing choice based on someone's protected class. So what is fair housing discrimination? It's treating a person differently in any housing transaction because that person is a member of a protected class. And there are fair housing laws that prohibit land use regulations, restrictive covenants, and conditional or special use permits that may limit housing choice based on protected class. So it's a little bit more details about that. That cities, they need to be looking at decisions so that they're not accidentally disparately impacting one group over another. So just kind of reading between the lines, thinking a little more deeply about fair rules and codes so that they're not disproportionately affecting one group over another. Let's talk about who these groups are. Who are these protected classes? So we'll go into a little bit about the history of these groups and how they were identified. So the civil rights movement had been, in motion for many years, but it was 1 week after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that President Lyndon B. Johnson, the president of the time, signed into law the Fair Housing Act. And fair housing, the act initially at that time included 4 protected classes, and those were race, color, national origin, and religion. And there was a lot of distress and rioting happening, and so and again, this is a piece of legislation also actually that was trying to be put into action for a long time. So a lot of other civil rights laws had been passed, but this piece of legislation around housing was very difficult to pass. There was a lot of opposition, not only in the South, but in the North as well. So, at this time, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the act into law to quell the riot. And because they really couldn't hold this back any longer, this law was needed so that our country could be addressed. So the federal government said these groups experience discrimination in housing, and we're not going to allow that. Of course, within these groups, more people than others experience discrimination. So if we're talking about, for example, color, then we know people who are Black and people who are brown are more likely to experience discrimination in housing than people who are white. So within these groups, there are certain groups within there, of course, that experience more discrimination than others. So then in the 1970s, the women's rights movement was making itself known. And as a result, sex was added as a protected class, because before that, what we were hearing was housing providers would say things like, oh, I don't know if you'll make enough money to pay for this, housing, or I don't know if you'll be able to keep up with the maintenance of the property. specifically because maybe you are a woman and they would be denied housing. So the federal government stepped in and said, no, we're not going to allow that anymore. Everyone should have housing choice based on no matter who they are. And so then also you can see below the protected class of sex, we now have additional categories built in. So we have survivors or victims of domestic violence are included here. Also sexual orientation and gender identity are also included under the protected class of sex. Then in the 80s, familial status was added. And that means anyone raising children under the age of 18. So before this class was added as a protected class, what we often saw was a lot of advertising that said no pets, no kids. And my mom was a single mom with 4 kids trying to find a rental. And I'm sure when we came in tow, that housing providers just changed their mind. You know, the unit's no longer available to you because you have children. So again, in 1987, familial status was added as a protected class because the federal government said, no, we're not going to allow this. Families with children deserve housing choice. It's also important to note that in Oregon, before familial status was a protected class, nearly 70% of all rental properties were blocked to families with children. So you can imagine it would be very hard to find safe, stable housing if such a small percentage of the available units were available to you. Then also in the 80s, disability was added as a protected class. And this had been in motion for a long time. The independent living movement started way back in the late 60s, early 70s. And people with disabilities were, you know, before this movement, many folks were living in congregate settings. Many people were there against their will. It was just kind of part of a system that was put in place. And in these congregate hospital settings, a lot of times people's basic rights were not being upheld. So, you know, as a result, many years later of the independent living movement, and also, you know, a lot of funding changed, the folks were leaving those congregate settings and moving into the community. And what they found was that discrimination was a huge barrier to finding housing. So again, the federal government stepped in and said, we are going to add disability as a protected class because they deserve housing choice like everyone, right? We all deserve the same access to housing. So then Oregon goes on to add its own set of protected classes. So depending also on if you go to another state, they could also have their own protected classes. Some have none, some have additional protections. So here in Oregon, we have marital status. So it doesn't matter if you're single, married, or divorced. Those things should not come into question when you're going into a housing transaction of any kind. Source of income. We're very lucky that source of income is protected here in Oregon. And people are still, despite the fact that it's protected, are experiencing a lot of discrimination when you're using a housing choice voucher or another kind of agency, you know, rental payment of some kind. Housing providers will still say things like, we don't accept those, which is illegal in Oregon. If the voucher meets the rental requirement, then someone should be able to use it there. And then you can also see we have these you know, abbreviations here. One is temporary assistance for needy families. The other is Social Security income, and then also Social Security disability income. These incomes were not explicitly written into the law, but case law has been settled in favor of people who experienced discrimination because they were using those sources of income. So we know to include them now. It was the legislative intent that they were included. So we shouldn't be hearing things like a housing provider saying, oh, I'm not going to accept that temporary assistance for needy families as part of your income to qualify for my housing. Then also in Oregon, we have the protected classes of sexual orientation and the protected class of gender identity. And some folks say, wait a minute, we heard about those on the last slide, and you absolutely did. Oregon was just ahead of the game and added these protections before the federal government did, which just happened with our current administration. So I believe it was in 2003 or 4 that Oregon started covering, added sexual orientation and gender identity as 2 additional protected classes here. And then depending on where you're going, in Oregon, there could be local protected classes as well. One that those are protections that cities or counties will add. an example is that in some cities that have a college, they'll add age over 18, because what we hear is that housing providers will say no one can rent these units unless you're 22 and older. But then there are so many college students between the age of 18 and 21 who are looking for housing. And so the city says, no, they deserve the same housing choice in our community as everyone else. And they go on to add them as a class. So depending on also which city you're in, if you're traveling today for the conference or if you're here virtually, makes sense to check them out in your city. You can look on the city's website or the county website, and usually they're pretty easy to find if there are additional classes. Okay, with that, we're going to move into a brief history of discriminatory land use, which is really important to look at this history so that we know why our communities look the way they do today. All of these policies that were put in place have lasting impact today. So between the 1930s and the 1980s, the US government enacted institutional policies that solidified practices to segregate America and to segregate our cities. So the Federal Housing Administration gave out loans, many of them, and there'll be more on this in a bit, but they were largely made available to white people only. So it created a huge gap in home ownership. VA loans were withheld from folks who are African American, or if they did receive those loans, they had a much harder time placing them in communities where their properties would later appreciate and gain value. And again, this was due to racist policies that were built into the fabric of our society at no fault of the person who served their country and maybe got that loan. In many cities, when new freeways or highways were built, they often demolished entire neighborhoods, and predominantly those occupied by people of color, to build the freeway. So in addition, the freeways often segregated existing communities and neighborhoods with concentrations of people of color who were living there already, or concentrations of people who were living in poverty. So this is a great example of when this happened, a sad example, but a true one, was in Portland when the I-5 was built. It cut directly through neighborhoods where most of the city's Black residents lived. And then we also had white flight. This happened after World War II when the suburbs were being constructed, and the great majority of those suburbs were made available to white people only. Predatory banks used discriminatory practices like blockbusting, which encouraged white homeowners to leave inner city neighborhoods and move into the all-white suburbs. They often used racist propaganda to scare white homeowners into selling their homes. And we have urban renewal or removal, which is basically gentrification. And quite often, what it turns into is displacing entire communities of people who lived there before. So the housing that was maybe deemed blighted or it's older, those neighborhoods are renovated with tax dollars, and then the original residents are asked to leave when the housing is remodeled or built. When they, come back to maybe, check out the housing or try to stay in the community, the rent has gone up so much that many folks have to leave and locate to areas where there's even less housing choice in the city. So again, the neighborhood is, restored with all of these tax dollars, and then the original residents don't get to benefit from those changes. And then redlining was the discriminatory practice of rating neighborhoods for stability, using the presence of people of color or new immigrants as a major factor for deeming a neighborhood unstable, which we know those are not the factors that contribute to what makes the neighborhood stable or not. So these neighborhoods were lined in red on maps that were used by the Federal Housing Administration and financial institutions to deny loans and homeowners insurance to redlined areas, ultimately blocking home ownership from the people who lived in those neighborhoods. And it also all but assured that those areas would face disinvestment for decades to come. And predatory lending is still a huge problem today. There's a lot of stories about it in the news now, which is great that it's being publicized. People understand what's happening. And we do have some homeowner presentations that talk more about that. If you're interested, you can check us out for those in the future. So, Federal Housing Administration loans. Before 1934, Americans usually had to pay 50% down to buy a house, which was unaffordable for most Americans. When the Federal Housing Administration started backing home loans in the 1930s, folks could pay a much smaller down payment and get a 30-year fixed mortgage, which is kind of like the numbers that we see today to buy housing. And it made single family housing a mass market product, which it never had been in the US before. However, these opportunities were not made available for all Americans. The redlining of neighborhoods, predominantly communities of color, led to extreme racial inequities in the Federal Housing Administration loans. And between 1934 and 1962, of the $120 billion in loans made by the Federal Housing Administration, less than 2% went to non-whites. So this government policy accounts for much of the inequity that exists in homeownership today. While white Americans had the opportunity to gain financial wealth from their real estate investments from the 1930s to the 1960s, many Black Americans were not able to do that. So they have a lot longer to go to catch up because of these racist policies. And restrictive covenants, it's important to note that they were used to prevent the sale of homes to people of color. This was actually language that was written into the deeds of homes that stated they could not be resold to people who were Black or other racial minorities and various religions. And the Supreme Court declared that these restrictive covenants were unenforceable in 1948 in the case Shelley versus Kramer. But if you look, at the deeds of homes in this state that were built before 1940, you will see that often the language still exists in those deeds, which is really harmful to folks. And there's a program that's come out, it's on our website if you want to look at it. We did not develop it ourselves. It was developed out of Central Oregon from the Coalition of Black Leaders Assembly. And it's called the Good Deeds Program. And they're trying to help folks to navigate the process to remove that language from their deeds. So then in 1968, the Fair Housing Act is enacted. And the Department of Housing and Urban Development was named to enforce fair housing laws. And there were penalties that were instituted for violating the act, and jurisdictions were required to affirmatively further fair housing. And we'll talk about what that looks like in a moment. And this is a photo of President Lyndon B. Johnson signing the Fair Housing Act into law. So, we have the passing of the Fair Housing Act, but we still see many exclusionary zoning policies being practiced today. These policies restrict lower cost or higher density housing from being built, which in turn affects anyone who can't afford or maybe doesn't want to purchase a single family home. There's a lot of reasons why you might not want, to live in single family housing. It could just be that the maintenance of the property is too much. Maybe you're getting older and you'd rather live in smaller housing, where you don't have to maintain the property. So many different reasons why. These policies limit racial and economic diversity because lower cost housing is segregated into one area of town where that zoning exists. And they raise housing costs, excluding people from equal access to opportunity, especially in home ownership. So let's talk about cities. Why do cities have to follow their housing laws? How does the work that city councils are doing and city planners and code enforcement, where does that all intersect with fair housing? Well, cities make a lot of decisions about where housing can be built and who can live there. So does their zoning allow for low income or affordable or denser housing types to be built in neighborhoods where there's opportunity? Or is all the high density housing lumped into one area of town? How many people are allowed to live there? Their occupancy standards, they should be reasonable. What kinds of materials can be used to build housing? They have rules about that, and that really affects the cost of housing. What kinds of allowances they'll make for protected class citizens. For example, maybe somebody's requesting a ramp on the street or a handicap parking, and how codes are and ordinances are enforced, right? Because you can have these codes and say, yes, these are the things we're going to enforce. But if they're not being enforced equitably, then people are experiencing discrimination. So for example, maybe they're only enforcing certain codes for blight in certain neighborhoods, right? Where low income folks are living, or maybe there's concentrations of certain demographics, and then those folks would be disproportionately affected by the inequitable enforcement of those codes. And so again, fair housing and zoning intersect because those decisions affect protected class citizens. And planning and zoning decisions last for the lifetime of the decision for whatever it is that's being put in place. So a freeway or a house or a building can be there for hundreds of years, right? And those decisions really have a lasting impact. For example, if that freeway is, separating two neighborhoods and making, a barrier to access, right? Then that decision is going to last for a very long time. So what many people don't know is that the Fair Housing Act has a built-in law that pertains to cities and counties or jurisdictions, and it's called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. And it's about addressing discriminatory actions and working to undo the history of segregation. So it means eradicating and preventing discrimination and segregation in our cities today. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has been under an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing in all of its programs since 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. But they didn't always have a lot of guidance on how to implement it until later. So we've had more laws being passed so that they have teeth basically in this law. And affirmatively furthering fair housing is about, again, removing barriers to fair housing choice. And it creates ways for people to access housing choice and therefore opportunity. And jurisdictions that receive federal housing and community development funding, they're often called community development block grants, have a further obligation to do this work. So let's talk a little bit about Oregon's housing needs. As many of you probably already know, there is a housing crisis in Oregon. This information was provided by Oregon Housing Alliance. It was updated in 2021. Some of the, I think they say 2019 and 20 in some of the pictures here, but the website has said it's been updated. And what they do is they do a lot of research to find out what are the housing needs in Oregon, and then they can use that information to inform statewide policy and legislation. So what we're seeing here on this slide is that for every 100 families with extremely low incomes in our state, there's only 29 affordable housing units available. So we would need to build 97,128 units just to meet the current need today. And 1 out of 4 Oregon renters pays more than 50% of their income on housing, and that means that they're considered rent burdened. But 3 out of 4 Oregon renters with even lower incomes are paying more than 50%, which means that they are extremely rent burdened. Oftentimes, this means that folks can't afford other basic needs like clothing, healthcare, childcare, food. So very basic needs. So our neighbors are facing homelessness. If someone wants to rent a 1-bedroom unit in Oregon and be able to pay all of their other bills, they would have to make around $41,836 a year. But you can see from this guide or these images here that folks who are maybe older, who are living on Social Security or veterans pensions or retirement, they don't even make half that amount. And then on the other side here on the right side, they're using the school's data to show how many people are unhoused in Oregon. 1 in 27 students experienced homelessness between 2019 and 20. Again, these numbers, they said they've been updated, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that these numbers are greater now. And we know that if these are the amount of children who are living outdoors, and there's many other folks, their parents and adults. So this, this number grows with those other considerations. a lot of people are living unhoused in our cities. And workers can't afford to rent in our state. The mean renter wage in Oregon is $16.78 an hour. If someone was earning a minimum wage, like $13.50 or $14.75, depending on where they live, they need to work 81 hours a week to be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment, which is around, $50,000 a year. So you can see clearly that folks earning minimum wages are actually making about half the amount that they would need to rent a 2-bedroom apartment. And cooks, nursing assistants, I'll say, I was a preschool teacher for 12 years. They would be included in these groups. They do not make enough money to rent a 2-bedroom in Oregon. And home ownership is really out of reach for many Oregonians. If the median home value in Oregon is over $397,000, sorry, I was like, because the number is so high, then teachers and construction laborers can't afford to buy a house. Anyone earning the median renter's income would find it almost impossible to save for a down payment. And we recently held a statewide listening group with people trying to purchase homes in Oregon, and cost was absolutely one of the biggest barriers that people are facing. So all of those problems, right? Here's this big problem. What needs to be done to address the problem? How can we combat this housing crisis in Oregon? Well, we need to build more housing types of all kinds to meet the income levels of all Oregonians. We also must include unique housing types for specific situations to serve the needs, again, of all Oregonians. A great example is shelter housing. So many cities have no shelter housing, and as we know, many people are living outdoors. These are people who've lived in our communities their whole lives, but because rent is so expensive and wages are not going up to meet them, everything's being compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now people are finding themselves living in cars and outside. So we need to encourage affordable housing development in areas also with opportunities. So we're not just talking about quantity, because it's important. Yes, we need to build more, but we really need to talk about where it is being built. This is really important if we're going to be, we're talking about affirmatively furthering fair housing, so undoing patterns of segregation that are kind of built in from the laws and the rules and the systems that are already in place that we need to change. So location is very important. Folks need to have economic opportunities and access to good jobs, also access to great schools, access to food that is affordable and healthy. So we can't continue to segregate our communities because we draw these lines about where housing can be built. What are indicators of barriers to equal opportunity? Well, is low-income housing available where there's good education? Like I said, how are the schools performing? What are the scores like? Is there economic development happening? Are there tax credits being used to build more housing? Are there new businesses coming up? Are the cities using affirmative marketing maybe to promote housing to people who need it most? And is there a healthy economy? Are there food deserts? What does the infrastructure look like? Are there libraries, right? Like looking at where these things are, and then check out the map of the city. Are there affordable housing types within to have access to these amenities? And that's what we're talking about with opportunity. So how is the problem being addressed? What's this look like? The state of Oregon identified 14 state planning goals way back in the 60s and 70s with the passing of Senate Bill 10. Goal 10 was identified to provide for the housing needs of citizens of the state. Goal 10 states that buildable lands for residential use shall be inventoried, and plans shall encourage the availability of adequate number of needed housing units at price ranges and rent levels which are commensurate with the financial capabilities of Oregon households and allow for flexibility of housing location, type, and density. So for cities with a population larger than 2,500 residents, it also means including a broader range of housing types when they're deciding the needed housing units, right? And they're planning for those. So this means going beyond single family housing. And as part of this work, cities will complete a housing needs analysis. And housing needs analysis, it's both a product and a process that a city goes through to determine areas of need in their current inventory of housing and their buildable land supply to plan for housing needs of its residents for over a 20-year period, which is a really long time to start making these plans. And the big takeaway here really is that Goal 10 weaves in the idea of affordable housing for all residents. And Goal 10 does this through requiring that housing needs analysis considers the income levels of the residents who are living in the areas while they're planning for that future housing. And in order to do that, cities will need to plan to build housing for not just people who are buying single family homes, but people who are renting, and maybe different kinds of ownership opportunities. So maybe smaller housing types that can be owned as well. So thinking about the big picture and everyone involved. And the Fair Housing Council of Oregon helps to oversee the Post-Acknowledgement Plan Amendment Project, also known as the PAPAS Project. That's kind of a long name. The project began in 2015 as a collaboration between the Fair Housing Council of Oregon and Housing Lands Advocates. It's funded by Oregon Housing and Consumer Services, the Oregon Business Development Division, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And this group, what they do is they review post-acknowledgement plan amendments, or the PAPAs, across Oregon when those amendments either have insufficient statewide planning Goal 10 findings, so specifically about this, planning for the needs of all citizens, or if the Goal 10 finding did not support the adoption of the amendment. So just making sure things line up with that work, with that goal. And the goals of the project are to protect and promote affordable housing by reminding local governments of their Goal 10 obligations when necessary, and preserving error in the record for appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals, to raise awareness of Goal 10 requirements, of course, and to determine whether a post-acknowledgement plan amendment, if the adoption of that would violate the Fair Housing Act by discriminating against protected classes through disparate impact. So making sure that these rules, when they're actually put into place, they're not negatively affecting one of these protected classes more than other groups. So again, this group is essentially, what they're doing is reviewing changes to land use as cities complete their housing needs analysis, and the group looks them over to ensure they're meeting the requirements of the law. And it's an exciting part of the work that the Fair Housing Council of Oregon gets to do. So if cities and counties must plan for needed housing, then why is there an affordable housing crisis, right? Like, we have these rules in place, but the crisis is still there. So what are some of the barriers? There can be many barriers, as you all know, especially to develop housing. What we do is we share this information with community members so that they are aware of some of the barriers and maybe how they can be effective to combat some of these things, and just understanding where cities and developers are coming from, when they're saying these things are getting in the way to developing housing. So it could be, it's hard to get the funding together, right? The Urban Institute came out with this really great tool around that, where folks can actually kind of experiment with like a pretend affordable development and see how all of that funding plays out and how difficult it can actually be to get the funding together. So I recommend checking out that tool from the Urban Institute. Maybe it's finding the available land that's the problem. But what we hear about the most, or also updating infrastructure like sewage systems so that it can support these new developments that folks are putting in. But probably the one that the Fair Housing Council of Oregon hears about most often in our work is community pushback, or a lack of acceptance for needed housing developments, also known as NIMBYism, or not in my backyard. So what we do is, as an organization, we educate community members around these issues, and so that developers and cities can help to combat this movement and hopefully break down some fears so that folks understand what this housing will really mean in their community. So again, the term has been coined NIMBYism, which stands for not in my backyard. What we know is that NIMBYism comes from fear of who might live in new housing developments and how that housing might affect the neighborhood. Many of the misconceptions about needed housing types have been found to be largely untrue. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has really great resources on their website to combat NIMBY thinking. We use those tools and other research to educate the community and hopefully, again, help to promote this needed housing development. So what we hear about, the biggest concerns that we hear about are misconceptions about what the housing will look like. So what we talk to people about, because a lot of community members didn't know, I didn't know this until I started working with the Fair Housing Council, is that the builders of affordable housing like yourselves have to comply with all of the same restrictions on design and construction as market rate development. We share this with community members because they have this historical image in their head about what projects look like, right? They hear this word projects and they think, oh my gosh, it's going to be a big building and it's not going to be maintained, just like way back in the 1960s. We know that that's not how affordable housing works anymore. It's very well maintained and managed. Again, it has to follow all those same building requirements and restrictions. So it's not going to be looking like some of those projects that we hear about in major cities from back in the 60s. It actually is hugely beneficial for the community to have it there and it well kept and managed. We hear about the effects on nearby property values. So there is a great some information that came out of the Journal of Planning and Literature, and it was a study. It's actually a review of 17 academic studies that occurred over a 40-year period regarding the impact of subsidized housing on neighborhood property values. And the author, what they said was their big conclusion is that housing that was acquired and rehabilitated as affordable housing has a positive effect on nearby property values. And this is the big one for me because it just ties so well into what we've been talking today, and it's so true. Subsidized housing has no effect on nearby property values when it's sited in healthy and vibrant neighborhoods, when it's dispersed, and when it has, again, responsive, reasonable management, which I know I work with a lot of housing authorities here in Oregon, and most of them do. So negative effects on property values were more likely to occur when affordable housing is clustered and located in declining neighborhoods. And again, that means that it's all put into one area of town where there's probably not very many opportunities, and all of those things play into what then happens in the neighborhood. So if you build affordable housing in neighborhoods with opportunities, then again, you're probably not going to have some of those negative effects. We know that desegregating communities is what's healthy for communities. And then we hear about fear of increased crime, but researchers agree that high crime rates in areas with lots of public housing are not due to the housing itself. Again, it's due to the lack of opportunity in the area where the housing is built because it's all clumped in and segregated into one area. And we hear about the magnetism myth. So if we build, this is what the myth says, if we build emergency housing like a shelter for people who are unhoused, then more unhoused people will come to our community. But what we know is that most Oregon cities, in the cities, the majority of unhoused people living there have been long-term residents. Many of them grew up in the area and they had housing, but because the housing prices have gone up so much, again, wages have not risen to meet those. And with COVID-19 pandemic and so many people just lost their jobs, so a lot of people are living unhoused. They're living, here's another thing too, is so many of these people are almost like an invisible population. They're folks who are, living in cars that we don't see because they don't want to be harassed. So they're parking out of the way. People who are camping on BLM land. People who are definitely doubled and tripled up with friends and family in situations that are working now, but they're not long-term. If we build shelters, this is what we educate the community about. If we're building emergency shelter programs that they have a transition into the next more permanent housing type, these are the folks that are going to use it. These are folks who, they've lived in the communities their whole lives. And so they want to stay, and having pathways to more stable housing is a great way to do that. And oftentimes that pathway begins at the shelter. So this is the information that we're sharing with community members to offset these NIMBY attitudes. So the big takeaway here is that the public can come in and they definitely have a right to speak at community meetings, and they can and often do make discriminatory statements during these public meetings based on fears about just the things we were just talking about. And it's their right to show up and to speak their mind. However, statements are not allowed to be threatening of people's safety, and we hear about that. I heard about that recently in a town hall meeting when a project turnkey was being proposed, and there were community members there who were making threatening statements, and that city council did not stop those statements, which is a huge problem. That's their responsibility to stop them. But city government cannot make decisions that block housing choice for protected classes based on discriminatory statements. So while the community is allowed to come in and talk about how they feel about it, if the city government is not just that they don't have to cave into that, but they legally should not cave into those discriminatory statements if they're blocking housing choice for protected classes. And they can't also cause a disparate impact for a protected class either. So an example could be, maybe someone says, I want to open a home for adults living with disabilities in my community that has support services built in. Then at a city council meeting, community members come and say, we don't want those people living in our community. If the city were to say, then we're not going to allow that housing, they would be breaking fair housing law, because they're limiting housing choice for a whole group of people living with disabilities in that community. They deserve housing choice too. So hopefully the city would say, no, you're allowed to say these things. We understand how you're feeling. However, we're not going to make a decision that blocks housing for this group. So it's important to also note what happens when not in my backyard attitudes win out, and how devastating that can be for communities. So here's a story about that. Rogue Retreat, a nonprofit out of Jackson County, got funding together for a much needed emergency shelter project in Grants Pass, Oregon, which is in the neighboring county, Josephine County. The local neighbors and businesses pushed back, saying they didn't want the shelter. Most statements were discriminatory based on stereotypes and fear of the people who would live in the shelter. And this was a very clear example of othering. At first, the city council would not approve the project based on the community pushback, but later, after more talks with Rogue Retreat, they finally agreed to allow the shelter. But shortly after, the local business owners and neighbors put pressure on the owner of the property that was going to be used for the proposed shelter, and the owner pulled out of the deal, ultimately killing the project. As of now, there are no low barrier shelters in the whole county of Josephine County. And a recent point in time count for the county found that 1,422 people are living unhoused in that county. And a point in time count is basically when they try to count everyone who's living outside, and they have a whole process for how to do that. So it was really devastating because this was so needed, and the NIMBY attitudes won out, and now still, a year later, there's no housing. Over a year later, there's still no emergency housing in that county. So what about when it's successful, right? When these housing developments that are so needed actually come into play, right? I think we need to share this information with community members when we are going in as developers or city councils trying to promote these ideas and educate them about what is working. So Redwood Crossing is the first development in Salem, Oregon to offer permanent supportive housing to individuals experiencing homelessness or who are at risk of homelessness. Residents began to move in late August of 2020. So it's been going for a couple of years now. They use a housing first approach, which means that they set few preconditions for entry. And the people living at Redwood Crossings are wrapped with services to help them stay stable in housing. It's so important to build in those supports. One unique example of the services that they offer there is transitional rooms for people who are recovering from illness. So before, many patients who were discharged from the emergency room, some of them had surgeries. They did not have a place to go to recover from that illness. And there was a lot of money being spent on hotel vouchers to help folks. Some of them took them up on it, some of them didn't. But now that this housing is there, it creates a really safe place for people to go and recover from illnesses or from surgery. And this project has been hugely successful. It can be duplicated in other cities on different scales, depending on the need of each area. So, these are folks that we can talk to, the folks who developed Redwood Crossing, the folks who are at the Salem Housing Authority who are making use of it, and they have the success stories. We need to gather those stories and share them out with the community. So how can we encourage more affordable housing options in all Oregon neighborhoods? We already talked about Goal 10 and how cities need to be planning for housing. House Bill 2001 aims to provide Oregonians with more housing choices, especially housing choices that people can afford. The bill allows property owners to build additional housing types like duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and cottage clusters and mobile homes on lots that are zoned for single-family homes. What does that mean for Oregonians? When the zoning of entire neighborhoods are limited to single-family homes, it greatly contributes to increased housing costs and fewer housing choices. And these needed housing types, which is middle housing, we know, they already exist in a lot of Oregon neighborhoods, but they were outlawed for decades in many neighborhoods. Again, those zoned for single-family homes, and it perpetuated the segregation of Oregon communities. So House Bill 2001 will require updates to local land use laws that currently limit housing types or what kind of housing can be built on those lots that are currently zoned for single family housing, and city staff and elected officials submit those plans again to the pop-up project. So we can kind of look to see between the lines if they're actually making the changes that are needed for the law and that they comply with fair housing. And I just love this image. You've all probably seen it a million times, but this is the middle housing image of all the kinds of housing that they're promoting to be developed on those single family lots, which will really open up so much choice for Oregonians with different income levels. Oh, another important thing to talk about, one protected class that has been de facto segregated for decades are people with mobility-related disabilities. Not only is there a severe shortage of accessible units, but those units are almost exclusively in multifamily development, and almost, so many cities, right? If you look at the zoning map, you can see that the areas allocated for multifamily housing are in one area town, they're not spread out. And the percentage of people with mobility-related disabilities is increasing as the population ages. Oregon already has a significant gap between supply and demand in accessible units. We need to be producing 6,781 wheelchair-ready units a year, every year, just to meet the new growth. So it's really important to note too that it is a lot more affordable to build the units accessible from the beginning rather than retrofit them and fix them. It's cost a lot more money to make those changes later. And that is a really important point to bring up when we're talking about promoting accessible developments, right? Talking to cities about why is this so important? Well, your citizens are getting older. So a statistic that we have here is by 2035, okay, so this is out of Salem, it's on their housing needs analysis. So by 2035, 24% of the population of Marion and Polk counties is forecasted to be 60 and over, and that's up 16% from 2000. So just in that one small area of our state, you can see folks are getting older. They're calling it the silver tsunami, which means we need to be planning ahead for housing for everyone for this group. So most accessible units, again, for these accessible housing are in multifamily developments. And again, they've been required there since 1999. House Bill 2001 could change that because one of the units in quad clusters or cottage clusters need to be fully accessible. And cities can offer incentives to developers for building accessible units, like waiving fees for deferring fees for hookups, or deferring fees, sorry, for hookups or city utilities. And accessible units can also be prioritized for people with disabilities as a preference policy. So certain kinds of housing can have preference policies. If you want to look up a good example of that, check out Portland's ADU code. And here are some additional types of needed housing in Oregon communities so that we can encourage housing for all people. So this is, again, something that we share with community members so that they know there's so many kinds of housing that we still need. So affordable housing, again, that's usually housing that's federally subsidized. Multifamily housing, just denser housing types, right? That might not be, built with federal funds, but it can still be a lot more affordable to folks. Multi-income housing, I love this model where they have, one property with many kinds of units, and different units are made available to folks with different income levels. So we're desegregating kind of communities by socioeconomic status, and we're making sure that folks are, everyone's living together and supporting each other. Recovery facilities. So this could be people recovering from symptoms of a disability. For example, maybe substance abuse disorder or other kinds of disabilities where they need an in-between. Transitional housing, maybe people who are transitioning through major life changes. For example, maybe somebody transitioning from living outside to inside. Senior living. So again, with services, folks for older adults who need support services. Farm worker housing has been identified by the Oregon government as severely lacking, and we definitely need more. And of course, middle housing, which we went over a moment ago. So the next thing that we do in these presentations to community members, which is why I'm showing it to you, is we show them examples of housing, middle housing that is already existing in Oregon, because they, again, have misconceptions about what that housing is going to look like. And how it will impact their neighborhood. And some of them don't realize that they've been driving through neighborhoods with this kind of middle housing for a long time and never thought that it was problematic. So we like to show real examples of what this housing looks like. So this one is in Salem, Oregon. It's multi-units inside of a one structure on a single family lot. It was originally a single family home. The two upper units share an entrance off the porch, and the basement unit has a separate entrance along the side. And so we can show community members what this middle housing will really look like. And this one, especially fits into the neighborhood character, which is, not a requirement, but community members often find that to be important. This is an example of a courtyard apartment. This was in Woodburn, Oregon. This is owned by the Marion County Housing Authority. It's multi-building apartments. They have 8 fourplexes. There are 1 and 2 rooms for seniors, and they're serving seniors with incomes at or below 60% of the median area income. This is Oak Park Village in Staten, Oregon. The Oak Park Village is operated again by Marion County Housing Authority. The property is operated under HUD's multifamily Section 8 program and provides subsidized rent for seniors 62 and over who make at or below 80% of the area median income. So you can see it's housing that's, it's providing housing for folks who have different income levels, again, which is the goal of these bills that we've been talking about. I like this one. This is the Edelweiss building. It's a 4-story Bavarian themed building that's located in the heart of downtown Mount Angel, Oregon. And it's central to the community's annual Oktoberfest celebration. Constructed in 2006, it utilized low-income housing tax credits to build 28 one-bedroom apartments in the upper floors that provides affordable housing for seniors also, at 60% of the median income. So you can see like this housing not only supports folks who are seniors, but also is an important part of the community and their events. This housing can be really unique and can serve many purposes. These are multi-dwelling apartments or groups of buildings, again, on a single family lot. Let's educate the community about like what the definition is. This example is located in Forest Grove, Oregon. The example is an affordable housing development for farm workers and their families, which again is identified by the state as much needed. The project has 10 buildings with 4 to 5 units in each one, and the buildings are organized around pocket parks and shared community buildings. So it builds in additional amenities for families. So the big takeaway with House Bill 2001 is that it's producing adequate quantities and types of housing which meet the actual needs of current and future residents. And it should be central to every land use decision that jurisdictions make. Like that idea should be central and put first when they're making land use decisions. So what about some strategies to promote this kind of housing, right? Because we can talk about how much we need it, but how are we actually going to get there? Luckily, we don't have to reinvent any wheels. There's a lot of work that's being done in this arena already. House Bill 2003 will require cities with a population of 10,000 or greater to create a housing production strategy 1 year after their housing needs analysis deadline. So the bill was passed to ensure that jurisdictions are actually working to address the needs identified in that housing needs analysis, because it's easy to do the work, identify the need, but then it's like, okay, well, where's the actual, building going to be happening? What can we do to make that happen? So the strategies must include a list of actions a city will take, such as revising regulations or providing financial incentives to promote the development of all identified housing needs. And again, those are the needs identified in the housing needs analysis. So we don't have to create these strategies, although we can definitely come up with additional strategies and maybe combine some of these together. But the Department of Land Conservation and Development, also known as DCLD, has come out with a great guide that's filled with strategies designed to help cities to do this work. So we asked, what are your ideas in this? But first, what would you say? After hearing this presentation and thinking about these ideas, here are some questions to ask. What demographics are concentrated in your city or in the cities where you want to build affordable housing? What strategies might be used to desegregate those groups? What kinds of housing is missing in the city? What kind of housing needs are identified in that city's housing needs analysis? How can we get from those needs being identified to actual promotion of that development? What kinds of zone changes can cities make to promote the development of that housing in their city? So if developers are looking at these same questions and the laws, it's easy to find connections that you can use to promote your affordable housing, right? Because cities are already supposed to be taking these steps. By building this housing, you can help them to meet these requirements and steps. So again, DLCD provides a housing productive strategy guide, and it is filled with great strategies. There are 109 strategies in 7 categories included here. And here are just some of our favorites of inclusionary zoning. So inclusionary zoning could be requiring that a portion of the units within a market rate development be set aside as affordable housing. So we know some cities in California are doing this. It's not like a statewide rule, but this tool will often be combined with property tax exemptions, fee waivers, or development bonuses to offset the cost of affordable housing. And again, this strategy helps to desegregate communities by social economic status and often by default race. Short-term rentals can be seen as an investment strategy for small investors, but can also remove rental housing supply from the market. It's a huge problem in Oregon, especially on the coast or in bigger cities. And in effect, it drives up the rent for the local housing market. So to avoid this effect, regulations can include definitions for various forms of short-term rentals, defining use and occupancy standards, and even adding limits on the number of days they can be used for short-term rentals. Okay, this is probably my favorite one, removing parking requirements for residential use. It provides the opportunity to reduce the amount of lot area used for pavement and provides more space for housing and open space. And this strategy offers greater flexibility to site housing and reduces costs associated with providing parking, because it's very expensive to build all those parking spaces. That space, of course, could be used for living space. And in the end, what that does is, as you know, it creates a bigger payback for the person who developed housing if they can use that space for actual living space. It's great to, maybe build this housing by transit corridors, right? So it limits the need for those housing places. And many jurisdictions have been give communities and neighborhoods way too much veto power on both zoning policy and particular project proposals to keep others they don't approve of from moving in. So dedicate funds to educate citizens on poverty, exclusion, and racial dynamics. Remove policies that allow neighborhood opposition to evidence-based zoning proposals and individual projects. Decisions about what kind and how much housing goes where needs to be data-driven and focused on equitable outcomes instead of the best outcomes for those with the most money and the most privilege. So some ideas of strategies there. Another important thing to note, there are financial incentives. So here's an example of a financial incentive available in Oregon, which the city of Florence is using to promote development of middle housing, and they're on the Southern Oregon coast. So the multi-unit program tax exemption program is a state-enabled housing incentive program that allows cities across Oregon to exempt property taxes on residential improvements of approved multi-unit properties. So this is the missing middle housing we're talking about, for up to 10 years. So although the state of Oregon enables the program, each municipality has the opportunity to shape the program to meet its own goals by controlling program requirements, criteria, and the program cap. So Florence created these program requirements. They said the project must be fiscally feasible without the program, right? So it still has to be feasible. The project has to be within 1/4 of a mile of a fixed transit route, right? Likely they're going to try to minimize parking requirements. A minimum of 3 or more units has to be within the development. So again, it's missing middle housing. No short-term housing or transient housing. So they're not including, short-term rentals, or they're not including shelter housing within this requirement. Or within this project. New construction only, so not applying to rebuilding things or retrofitting. And they have to have public good benefits. So to receive this program, the developer has to show that their development meets 3 or more design public benefits, and the city has identified those. They identified 15 of them, different benefits. So it could be that the units are at sale prices or rental prices, which are accessible to the broad income range of the general public, right? So they're making these rules that kind of fit in to House Bill 2001 and 2003, all working together to promote this needed housing development. All right. So lastly, we encourage cities and developers to come together to educate community members about the need for the development of affordable housing, middle housing, and emergency housing. We offer resources to assist with that education. The Fair Housing Council of Oregon, that's what I mean by we. Neighbors can learn about fair housing by reading our Good Neighbor Guide. They can be found on our website under the Education tab in our resource library. There are also all kinds of other great resources here, and you can search by category for those. We encourage community members to stay up to date on the plans for proposed developments. We encourage them to stay on the city website, sign up for updates. Talk to nonprofits to learn, what kind of housing is coming up in your community. They can also inform us if there are fair housing complaints. As you know, we help to provide pathways to the enforcement of fair housing laws, and we can come in and train groups of community members around these issues. So if you as a developer are working with a city and say, hey, there's a lot of community pushback against this needed housing, can the Fair Housing Council of Oregon parachute in and educate this community? Yes, we can, and we can provide follow-up technical support around those issues as well. And we encourage community members who support these ideas to gather and educate new allies. There's a lot of folks out there who really care about fair housing, so identifying those groups and encouraging them to get together. This will not only help to stop the spreading of harmful stereotypes and discriminatory attitudes, but also amplify a community members' ability to create positive change. We encourage community members to participate with their allies. So go to official meetings like town halls or city council meetings and speak up about needed housing development. Often the voices that are there are in opposition, but we know there are community members who support these ideas. So working together with those groups and having them come and talk about these things at those community meetings can really help. Sometimes people's ears open up when they realize, oh, this is another community member, another neighbor, right? Not just someone who wants to, in their mind, maybe profit off of this. Like these are folks who are just living in the community just like them. And we encourage them, of course, to stay informed, keep an eye on the newspapers and stories. Like oftentimes when there's community pushback for development, it's publicized and it's loud. And so we encourage folks to keep an eye on that so they know how they can go in and support and be effective in changing hearts and minds when it comes to needed housing development. And also, I would really like to encourage folks to please fill out our evaluation for today's presentation. This just helps our grant funders to know we were here, helps me to know how I can better serve you next time. If there are things you were hoping to learn in this presentation that you didn't, that I can include, please let me know. And my email was at the beginning of the presentation. I'm so happy to answer questions that way as well, follow-up questions. Please contact the Fair Housing Council of Oregon for more information. We have a hotline that is currently through a button on the website. Housing providers and developers can also contact us to ask any follow-up questions. And with that, I think I'm kind of close to the end of my presentation time, but what I would like to do now is stop my share to see if there are any questions that have come up. And Sam Goldberg, my colleague, an education and outreach specialist with us here at the Fair Housing Council, is also in the front of the room to assist with questions as well. All right, so with that, folks who are in the virtually here, you can also write your questions in the chat.
Can we have the microphone go over Zoom too?
Jamie, do you have access to the chat? Because I know there's some questions there.
I do see the chat. So I want to see the first question from Lisa. Sorry, I'm scrolling back through. Bear with me here. Oh, so it said they're talking about going, oh, yes, thank you so much. I see that someone said, I wonder if it would be helpful to understand the roots of this if we go back further. And it looks like there's a link here talking about the Trail of Tears that happened right here in Oregon. So I'm assuming that this is talking about going back to the roots of the displacement and illnesses and the effect that colonization of this state had effect on the indigenous peoples of Oregon. Yes, I absolutely agree that we need to go much further back. We have a really great history presentation that goes over a lot more of that history and others that I would highly encourage folks to sign up for and attend, that really goes over that history. I absolutely agree.
Yeah, a lot of the patterns of segregation that Jamie was talking about that got institutionalized in the 1930s, we kind of see a precursor to that in things like the Oregon Donation Land Act, which was only open to whites. And so it created, generational land ownership and wealth opportunities that were open to some and, deliberately excluded from many others. So yes, the pattern that Jamie was talking about from the 1930s to the 1960s, it definitely has its roots much earlier.
And then what is the impact of gentrification on communities of color? That is a really great question. Sam, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that we can pretty clearly see that there's a disproportionate impact on communities of color. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what gentrification means because it can look a lot of different ways. People can use the term to mean a lot of different things. When we talk about where the roots of the word actually came from, it was when it was coined by an English social scientist who was talking about about landowners, the gentry, who were buying up real estate in working class neighborhoods, who were generally renters, and buying up a lot of social housing, and then pricing out people who were not able to be homeowners or who could not compete with those folks. So now when we talk about it, we have a much broader definition. We talk about things like in the investments that cities make in parks and infrastructure and how that can increase land values beyond what the existing community can pay. So in these conversations, I mean, I know we can mean a lot of different things, but I think that the common thread through all of it is that it has a disproportionate impact on communities of color because of that history of institutional decisions.
Thanks, Sam.
Yes.
I don't
Here,
see any other
I'll give you the
questions.
mic so that the people on Zoom can hear it.
Great.
Are you guys aware of any efforts that are being made to ensure affordable housing stays affordable? Like, I know typically it's like 10 years after that, like private land developers can, sell their property, make it market rate. So are there any I know of community land trusts, but are there any in Oregon that are like doing similar efforts?
Do you have an answer for that, Jamie?
Gosh, I wish I did, but I don't.
Okay. Yeah, so the low income housing tax credit at the federal level that's generally how those things are funded. I believe that one is a 15-year period, which can then be extended for another 15 years. So that's max 30 years. And as people who live in cities with a lot of that financed housing are becoming aware of, all of them are starting to expire right around the same time. So a lot of those are losing that affordability status. I certainly, in any group that I participate in, I try and encourage cities when they give bonuses or incentives to affordable housing to do things to make it permanently affordable. Usually that's done through writing it into the deeds for the housing. I know that Jamie mentioned, exclusionary clauses that were written into housing for decades. Well, we can use those same tools for good. So that's definitely what I try and advocate for. Oh yeah, Proud Ground is a great local example. Thank you of community groups. Sometimes in the community land trust model that you were talking about, and then sometimes with other models that can keep it permanently affordable. Things like making sure that the resale value of the house is tied to the structure itself rather than the land, which tends to be where a lot of the inflation of costs comes from. So there's a lot of different tools, different models being kicked around.
Yeah, I also see in the chat, it says Habitat for Humanity in Benton county at least builds on CLTs with a limited equity model.
Yeah.
So looks like there's some other work being done in that arena.
We've got a couple minutes left. Anyone else in the room have a question?
Hi, I'm just wondering, I mean, besides the tax credit benefits themselves, what are other ways to incentivize like the developers from having more 30% units versus 80% units? Because that's what's really lacking right now.
Yeah, thank you. That's a big problem that we're seeing is that things that are defined as affordable housing are not affordable to the real people who live in communities. And so building that deeply affordable housing is really important. I think things like the mixed income developments that Jamie was talking about is a good way to approach that, because then you have market rate developments that are subsidizing the mixed income developments. But typically developers need to be forced to do that, to use models like that. So things like inclusionary zoning, which in Oregon currently only exists in Portland, those measures are probably going to be necessary to get those through. Yeah, other incentives are always great. You know, density bonuses are a really great tool for incentivizing developers to build affordability in. But for something that's that deeply affordable, especially when we talk about how much the value of land has inflated and how much construction costs have inflated, you need some pretty deep investments, deep tools to make sure that you're actually reaching that group. So there was a lot of questions about slides and whether slides were going to be available for folks. For the people in the Zoom room, it seems like we have a solution for that. For people who are here in person, come find me and I'll take your email address and we'll make sure to get it sent out. Yeah, Shail. Okay, yeah, we could do that. That's an incentive to come. Okay, yeah, perfect. Did you catch that, Jamie?
I did not hear that.
She's Shail said to email her and we'll have printed versions at my presentation tomorrow.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, yeah, it is also available on the conference website. So anyone who's on Housing Oregon can find it.
Thank you, everyone. You know, I actually don't know for the person who just wrote the question about Native Americans and land appropriation, but if you could email me, I'm going to put my email in the chat and then we can get together on that and I will let you know. Here's that email. Thanks for your question.